Now I give the floor to Professor Dr. Muhammad Abdul Wahab to deliver the keynote speech, and we see the title, The African Arbitrator, Present Statics and Future Dynamics. You have the floor.
Thank you so much. Very good morning to all of you, ladies and gentlemen. So good to see friends, familiar faces, towering figures from the continent and beyond. I see Chief Bayo Ojo, Judge Kajimanda, Lady Justice Joyce Aluch, our friend Victor Mugabe, Nakasamba from Zambia, many people. And I'm very grateful to Sally and Sammy for a very kind invitation to deliver this keynote. Those who know me forgive me for being candid and direct in addressing, I think, a topic that is close to my heart, which is what we do on the continent. And this time, I'm going to focus on the African arbitrator. I will explain that in time. My challenge is that I have limitations, time limitations. But the upside is that for those who practice construction arbitration would know that now we are in time at large. We have started a bit late. So I'm going to contribute a little bit to further the delay, and then we can conduct the delay analysis to see the causation aspects. But let me start with this. I'm going to start by addressing what I call the movement from the DRP to the DRR. Then I'm going to talk about data, facts, and inferences, which was a very challenging journey when it comes to Africa and African practitioners. And I'll tell you why in a moment. Then I'm going to focus on what I call the present statics and future dynamics. This is, of course, borrowed from physics, and I'm going to explain that in due course. So from DRP to DRR. Africanization and international arbitration. When we talk about this, I'm also grateful because we have Professor Emilia Onyema in the room. So she's done great work. Dr. Kenneth Mutoma, again, from Kenya. So we have excellent people who really know what we're talking about. The process. We've been focusing on the process, boosting the image of African seats. And let me tell you this, when anyone tells you today that is it safe to have an arbitration in Africa as an African seat and venue, do not shy away telling them it is safer than the US and Europe, because that is the reality of today's world. So we've been focusing on the process, the applicable laws, the outcome, the resources of Africa, which everyone in the world has a great interest in. And then we're moving again to the players, parties, institutions, resolvers, counsel, and experts. My focus in this is on the resolvers, the arbitrators. And to move forward, I will start with the data, facts, and statistics. I'm not going to go through them all, but I can tell you that it has been very difficult to put it together, including manual counting of cases, literally, as well. So we talk about inclusivity and how Africa and Africans have contributed to the world of international arbitration. Yes, we are no longer passive. There is an active African voice, but the figures will not lie. And I'm going to shock you with the figures that we see. How inclusive is international arbitration of African arbitrators? Then, whether this inclusion is dependent on African nationality of the parties, the governance of African laws, or specific sectors, so that we dispel the myths and misconceptions about the fact that African arbitrators are appointed by African parties, or perhaps only good for African cases. You will see that there is absolutely no correlation in reality to that. The methodology, quickly. So the statistics and data have been drawn from 10 institutions. Now, these institutions did not offer those statistics easily, nor are they visible from the reports. I had to dig deep, compare, and look into the numbers through other sources, including, for example, Yusundi, all the problems they have, because many of the information on these, by the way, databases is not entirely accurate. Then I'm going to address the variables in those cases, looking specifically to a correlation or causation with African parties, African laws in specific sectors, where the African resources and trade is key. Then the challenges and the gaps in the available data. I looked at 10 years, 2015 to 2024. These have been manually searched and counted in terms of the available resources. I will start with the challenges because I think it is important to proceed with that. But let me tell you one thing. The African arbitrator I'm looking at is strictly the individual holding the nationality of an African state, and that includes dual nationals. Now, people may think this is a very simplistic approach, but today in the world of AI, I'm talking about the individual. At least we can enjoy it while it lasts, that humans are in power. So the challenges. One, I divided those challenges into a number of sectors. When you look and compare the 10 institutions I looked at, there is no uniform standard approach to reporting data and statistics. It's one of the major problems in the world of international arbitration. There isn't an easy distinction between domestic and international cases, reported sectors, nationality of arbitrators, or assimilating them in different regions. There is a varying level of details. Some international institutions have details, others aggregate the data and present you the figure that we don't know whether it can be verified or not. And sometimes the data is inaccurate. And this is not a function of institutions present on the continent, not at all. I will show you that some international institutions actually have problems with the data they are reporting. I'm going to be very candid. It's a perilous path to walk because I'm going to take on the major institutions in the world, including ones with which I'm affiliated. And this is not intended to showcase that they have problems, but it is intended to showcase that we as Africans have problems. Then another area where we have different standards, the aggregation of data and the absence of granular data on a more microcosmic level, if I'm allowed to use that word. We have as well incomplete and inconsistent institutional data. Now, as I mentioned, institutions are doing their best, but to give you an idea, there hasn't been that consistency throughout the 10 years period. DIAC, for example, in Dubai, do not provide publicly available numerical data and statistics concerning the appointment of African arbitrators. Cairo Regional Center, and we'll see the reports from 2020 onwards, have been consistent. But before that, there is, when you look at the data, the counting of African arbitrators, for example, include Egyptians. And with cases of domestic, if we say we appoint 90% Africans, well, out of that 90%, there is no less than probably 80 or 90% that are Egyptians. So we need to be cautious about this, and we will see that. The other data, like from the ICC, LCIA, SIAC, and ICSID, are also interesting because you will have to see that there is some partial and fragmented aggregation of data. The SEC reports specifically are interesting because in 2023 and 2024, for example, they have no numerical data on African arbitrators. And in fact, sometimes it shows 0, when as a matter of fact, I know for a fact there is more than cases because I'm sitting in some cases as an African. So in reality, the data is not entirely reliable. We're going to go through that. For ICSID, it's a bit different because ICSID has a very consistent and structured reporting of data that is quite comprehensive. Now, that is in the realm of investor-state dispute settlement. But when they report data, that includes arbitrators, conciliators, and ad hoc committee members. Now, that made it difficult because I had to extract manually the arbitrators' data from the conciliators and the ad hoc committees, and to verify this as well with other sources for cases that may not be public but have been reported. And let me say this is related to ICSID, but there are so many other institutions that deal with investment arbitration. But speaking to some of the people at the helm of institutions, the statistics are not that different. And we'll see that ICSID is really an institution that has done a lot in terms of supporting Africa and the continent. There is also a lack of detail on arbitrators' roles, those serving as arbitrators, co-arbitrators or presiding, sole arbitrators, were they party appointed or institutional appointment? Are they different individuals or the same usual suspects that we see as well? Or also dual nationals? Remember, there are many Africans outside the continent practicing, so they contribute to the statistics showing African sitting. But that is also a problem because, as we will see, the data doesn't enable you to verify who and what is the percentage even on a country-by-country level in many cases. There are also confidentiality concerns regarding the accurate number of cases, arbitrators' nationalities, identities, and sectoral classifications. As I mentioned, I looked at a number of platforms to verify data, and it was interesting because you can see some wrong information there as well on those databases. Secondary resources. The SOAS Arbitration in Africa survey was extremely helpful. And thank you again, Professor Onyema, for the great work that has significantly contributed. The issue there is that the appointment figures are typically aggregated at the continental level. So I'm sure that she ran into the problems that I faced as well. No breakdown by year or country or institutional arbitrators rule. There's also reliance on voluntary disclosure and self-reporting, which may not be entirely accurate in many cases. Now, that tells us one important reality, that we need to do more on the continent to report before we can go to the world and tell them that we would like to contribute or that we have a problem. Then, looking at the 10 institutions, the ICC, LCIA, SIAC in Singapore, SSC in Stockholm, HKIAC, DIAC, the Cairo Regional Center, NCIA in Kenya, KIAC in Rwanda, and ICSID. As I mentioned, you will have the data, and I'm happy to share that, but I'm going to go, I looked at specifically just to show you these. I'm going to glance through that because I'm going to go directly to the graphs. Now, whenever there is a reference, this means I effectively looked into these sources. But I'm interested now to effectively, now the ICC has very strong reporting and detailed reporting, even on a country level of the arbitrators. But let's look at the trends of African appointments over 10 years period, 2015 to 2024. You can easily look that the highest mark for appointing arbitrators was 4.8%, and precisely by the number of cases in that year, that would be account to about 73 cases. 73 cases involving African arbitrators. That's the highest record at the ICC. You can easily look at this there. The range has been confined. There is a confinement to 2 to 5%. And by the way, across institutions, this has been the best percentage. So we don't cross the threshold with this, except with ICSID, 6.5%, but there are for reasons. But Africans, their ceiling is 6.5%, and that only happens in a year. The 5% or the 4.8 only in 1 year as well. So Egyptians in the ICC, Egyptians, South Africans, Nigerians, and Tunisian arbitrators top the list, followed by Moroccans, Kenyans, Algerians, and Cameroonians. So we're basically talking about 8 nationalities. When you look at 8 nationalities, 54 countries, the percentage is somewhere between 6.75%. So 6% out of a total of 4% in the cases. So imagine. And then you have effectively the distribution unevenly. Egyptians stand out with 175 appointments over 10 years out of 565 appointments. That is around 30% of African appointments. Now, the 565 is the total number of African appointments in the 10 years, not the appointments of the ICC. The ICC is much more than that. So Egypt, within the ICC, the Egyptians, 30%, but around 1.2% of the overall appointments. So those are things that Egyptians are privileged, not necessarily, because effectively, it doesn't account for more than 1% of what the ICC cases are. Followed by Nigerians, South Africans with 65 appointments each over 10 years, which is around 11.5%. Let me tell you this, all the institutions that you will see the statistics, I can tell you that it's really not their mistake, because institutions are actually appointing and providing faith in arbitrators more than the parties. So the percentages that you see are actually because of the institutional faith in appointing people for the first time, when the parties don't have that. So I say that because people can easily blame the institutions when actually institutions are doing their best, but we are not. I will come to that in my closing. So overall, Africa remains underrepresented. It is a fact, but the numbers are there. The LCIA, also data is available, but with a lower level of granularity and specificity. Again, the top is 4.5% of the cases. There are 26 cases in 1 year, 2019. This was the highest, 4.5%, including recent years, 2.4. So the idea that statistics are gradually growing for Africans is incorrect. And by the way, it's not just us. Latin Americans and certain parts of Asia, Eastern Europe are actually doing even worse than us. So if I take this, if you look at the number of African appointments, they fluctuated between 1.8 to 4.5%, with an average of 2.2 to 3.5. Effectively, again, but for the LCIA, remember for the ICC, Egyptians top the list. For LCIA, it is the South Africans, 35 appointments, representing 31% of the 113 African appointments throughout the 10 years period. Nigerians followed with 30 appointments, representing 26.5%, and Egyptians 17 appointments. But again, combined, when you aggregate these three African countries, 72.5% of all African appointments, right? And again, on a continent, the three countries, in a continent of 54, effectively, you're looking at a very, very low percentage. SIAC, it's even worse. In fact, much worse. You effectively look there, the ranges somewhere between 0.3%. Look at the number of cases. I provided not just percentage, number of cases. 2015, 1 case. 2018, 0, no Africans. The highest, you've had 4 cases, 2017, 2019, 2023. And effectively, South Africans top the list with 12 appointments representing 57% of the 21 African appointments. Now that is over a period of 10 years. And I can tell you that because you will realize people can stand before you in speeches and tell you things like this. I was going to say that at the last, but I need to tell you this so that you understand. Oh, we're not getting appointments. It's looking bad. I am telling you openly, I am a beneficiary of that system. I benefit from that system. I am not effectively, if I were to stand to you today and to lie, no, I contribute to those statistics. I'm getting my fair share of this, but it's only a few people. Is that fair to others? No. Am I benefiting? Yes, I am. I get a fair share of these percentages and these appointments. In fact, in some of those cases, when they say 1 or 2, it's me. It's no pride and nothing to hide. Is it right? No, but we need to do more. And I'm telling you that candidly. So it's effectively, I'm standing before you today with an opposite or reverse conflict of interest to say that I'm a beneficiary and this is not right. SCC, none. You can see that, a lot, none. Anyway, 2024, they report none. How can you report none? I already have 2 cases at the SCC. So anyway, the reality is that you have issues that are quite problematic in that sense. DIAC, the 2 reports are available, 2022 and 2023. Now, let me tell you, I know very well that since 2023 onwards, they have effectively adopted a policy of inclusion and diversity strongly by appointing African arbitrators. How do I know that? Not just by speaking, because I'm sitting with a number of them on cases. And I know that others are being appointed. But they are doing a lot of effort to identify Africans to appoint. So effectively, before blaming institutions, we should blame ourselves first by, are we available for appointments? And let me say available. It's not about networking and it's not about coming to events. It's about people who can do the work, qualified. Institutions put their reputation at stake by taking a leap of faith of appointing people. So it is extremely important that you have qualified people. So before we effectively say we are not being appointed, think hard how many people on one hand in the African continent can you think of as qualified people to do the work? It doesn't mean that there aren't many qualified people. There are, but they may not be visible or known to many. HKIAC. Now, before, an example, Joanne Lau came. She's not with us. She's the Secretary General. Look at this, the figures. 0, 0, 0, right? Joanne started coming. She came to Kenya. And I know, remember Dr. Mutoma, she's trying to identify arbitrators on the continent to appoint. So you can see that in 2024, there are 4 appointments out of 419. Good figure? No. But who is available and how do we know and identify them? Remember, you can write CVs as you wish. But the CVs will not necessarily reflect the quality or the reality in that sense. So effectively, I can tell you that the 2025 statistics for HKIC are even going to look better in that sense, and it will include more Africans. Remember, these low percentages includes as well repeat appointments of people like us. I'm telling you candidly. The Cairo Center, as I mentioned, there has been good reporting about Africans all throughout, but at least from 2020 onwards, we have consistent data with breakdown of nationalities. But when you look really at the figures, you will find that between 2020 and 2024, there were 16 non-Egyptian African appointments from 7 African countries: Tunisia, Sudan, South Africa, Nigeria, Morocco, Cameroon, and Tanzania, out of 707 cases for the 10-year period. Now that represents 2.2% of African non-Egyptian appointments, because the Egyptians, when you look at the figures, is 97.8. And again, you cannot blame the institution. The institution, like the Cairo Center, they send the list to the parties in order to strike and rank, and the institution would make an appointment. But for example, the lists of the Cairo Center includes Africans. And this is a reality. And Dr. Salim has been promoting this, and Dr. Dalia as well, a lot. So effectively, they are trying to do. But if we stay on this course, and if we continue to champion our views that Africa is doing great and we're doing very well, the percentages will not increase. And we will come next year, in 10 years' time, and nothing will change. The NCIA, again, you look at that, you find there is reference to somewhere between 78% to 83% Africans. Yes, that is true, but because they are mainly Kenyans. Kenya, Nigeria, and Zambia. Again, 3 countries only, which is very interesting. When you look at the reports, and I looked at them one by one, you find that there is a consistent reference to either 81 or 83%, consistently 71 from Kenya, 5% from Nigeria, and 5% from Zambia. Interestingly, the percentage doesn't change. And then you have only 2020 to 2021, 4% from Nigeria and 4% from Zambia, but 75 Kenyans. And it continues. The trend continues until 2023 to 2024. For some reasons, the Kenyans were not happy with the Zambians. So they only looked at 75% Kenyans, followed by 3% Nigerians. Or maybe the Nigerians had something to do with it. Tell them, it was the percentage. So you never know. KIAC is doing very well as well. And Victor Mugabe, our friend, is also, and I know this because I have seen how they are handling cases and trying to promote that. Effectively, they're trying to diversify. So you've got Nigerians, Kenyans, Egyptians, Ethiopians, Ugandans, and Tanzanians. But still, the numbers, again, effectively, most of the percentage effectively are from Rwanda. But again, also Nigeria, Kenya, and few others. There is a lot of work to do. Exit, again, in the ISDS realm, is different because the data available is much easier to access. But I'll show you this. Now, when you look at exit, you'll see that they are moving consistently. Where, again, 2021, 4.8% has been high. But then 2024, 15 appointments representing 6.5%. Because effectively, exit is very conscious of how can they actually provide for more appointments to Africans, Latin Americans, Asians, Eastern Europeans. They are doing a lot of work on this front. To give you an idea, a breakdown of appointments when it comes to exit cases, you're going to see that on the next slide. Now, these numbers are manually counted. They are not figures present in exit reports. So this pie chart, when you look at it effectively, you will find that Egypt, Nigeria topped the list with about 35% of African appointments. Egypt came second with 18%. Then Mauritius, 9%. Morocco, 6%. South Africa, 6%. Burundi, 5%. Kenya, 5%. And Somalia, 4%. Now, I just want to give you the idea of the landscape so that you don't think that the world is against Africans. The world is not against Africans. And I sympathize with firms and people. When you are prosecuting, and that includes me, when I'm prosecuting a case as counsel, it is not a trial and error situation. To tell you this, it is not because you want to boost the percentages of Africans or Latin Americans that you're going to take a leap of faith to make an appointment. You want to get an arbitrator, effectively, if you're a lawyer, to win the case. right? This doesn't mean that he needs to be partial in any way, but you need someone who's got the gravitas, the intellect, the ability that when he sits in a tribunal, there will be a certain weight and there'll be a certain proper, let's say, presence within the tribunal. So when you look at those, Africans, we're not on our own. In fact, Eastern Europeans are worse, right? And you look at even Central Americans. But when you look at North America and Western Europe, you'll see then there is the, let's say, the big chunk goes to those two regions or areas. Now, looking at the variables, they may tell you the African promise that Professor Onyema has done, the pledge that in 2018 I proposed, all this. Now, speaking of this, the pie, Africans appointing Africans, or African laws being a ground to appoint Africans, or perhaps specific sectors. The data does not support these findings. So as hard as it was, as it gets, I looked at data sets comprising 116 to 123 commercial arbitrations involving African arbitrators, right? That involved a manual count of each case, looking at industry sector, party nationality, arbitrator nationality as well, the applicable law, and the appointment method and institution to try and distill something. Now, that is in the realm of commercial arbitration. I'm going to come to investment shortly. Out of the 116 cases reliably looked at and reviewed, only 89 disclosed data regarding the nationality of the parties, and only 63 disclosed data regarding the applicable law. The correlation, whether in relation to the applicable law or the nationality, was very weak to suggest that Africans are best suited for cases involving African parties or African laws. You look at that effectively, less than half of the cases. The same applies for the applicable law. Now, on the sectors, it is a bit interesting because Africans seem to be within their margin of 0% up to 6%. And by the way, 6 is an investment, up to the 4.8, sorry, percent in commercial arbitration. Seems to be favored because in construction, energy, believe it or not, in commercial arbitration, mining comes later, but transport, logistics, and financial services, right? So that makes you think, okay, so people like Africans sitting in those cases. If I were to stand before you and say that, that would be misleading. The reason I could find for that is because construction and energy represent the highest percentage of cases. So it makes sense that only Africans have a fair small percentage of this being represented. And when you look here on this slide, you find that construction and energy are among the top 3 with transportation and logistics as well. Now, for exit, now moving to investment arbitration, I looked and done a manual count of publicly available ISDS cases involving Africans. Again, looked at the Jus Mundi, and also actually supported by the research paper by Sodipo and Co. in Nigeria, which have done a review of exit cases over 50 years. When you look at that, it was interesting. African arbitrators were appointed in only 28.4% of the cases, 52 cases. But non-African arbitrators were appointed in 183 cases involving African parties. Interestingly, there has never been an exit case, and I will stand before you and dare say, in an investment case, right, where you had 3 Africans sitting in a tribunal. And I say that because when you talk about gender, it is now you see that you have 3 women sitting in tribunals, which is excellent. That's why I think the idea and the success of gender sort of awareness in arbitration should be replicated as a success story in relation to ethnic minorities. Speaking in relation to Africa, this is our vested interest there as well. But then, looking in terms of the applicable law, out of the 52 cases, effectively, we had limited data on, well, 10 cases did not have sufficient information regarding the applicable law or treaty, because of course it's treaty-based arbitration in that sense. But interestingly, you're talking about less than 12% of those cases involving an African arbitrator just because there's African law. So there is no majority, there is no correlation. And effectively, now I'm standing before you in Egypt, may not be culturally correct, but it's not my words. That's why I put the guy there so that I'm not saying it. Yeah. So statistics are like bikinis. What they reveal is suggestive, but what they conceal is vital. Right? Yeah, men like this, huh? Okay. Okay. So there is no causation, there is no correlation that you can identify with sufficient confidence to suggest that Africans are favored by African parties or when African law is the applicable law. Sectors could be misleading because construction and mining, by the way, in investment ranks second after construction in that sense and energy. So effectively, what about telecoms, agriculture, maritime, insurance, water resources, defense? Now, by the way, for maritime and insurance, the English, they dominate. They dominate, right? And they dominate. And in fairness, I sit very well with them. Many of them are friends. They dominate literally. So effectively, there is a lot of work to be done in that sense to avoid the continuity of this marginal representation of African arbitrators. And I think the same can be true with different statistics for Eastern Europeans or Latin Americans at the international level and certain parts of Asia. So that brings me again, and I know at least I've done well. I think now I'm almost the 30 minutes, but I'll finish shortly. Present statics and future dynamics. So this is where it is. So I use the term present statics because those who know a little bit about physics and mechanics, which is a branch of physics, would know that statics deals with literally a body or an object at rest or moving with constant velocity, no acceleration. And this to me represents effectively the statistics that don't go up. It's literally locked, we're confined to this percentage. But then you want to change the discourse and you want to have a more dynamic approach, which is effectively the same body at rest or with constant velocity is going to move at an accelerated pace to increase our percentages of representation worldwide for international arbitration. There you go. Now you can decide whether you're happy with the present statistics or you wish to change the dynamics for the future. The last thing I will tell you, it is extremely unhelpful, and I must say unfair to the world, that we represent ourselves as victims of a system. Victimizing ourselves has not taken us anywhere and will not take Africans or others anywhere. You want to stand up, you need to have the substance to compete, to break through. It is difficult for us compared to others, that is true, but it's not impossible. So I'm going to present you with 7 + 7 about the present statistics and the future dynamics. So the present statistics, effectively, and the statics of it, is that one, there is lack of complete, detailed, and accurate data on African appointments, because I'm going to build on that for the dynamics before I end. Now, between pledges and promises, I talked to Emilia about that, and she knows my views, that you cannot, and we cannot as Africans, have the high hope and best bet to sit in cases involving African parties. Why can we not?
That's it.
So effectively, with the record-breaking ceiling of 6.5% of African appointments in a given year in only one institution, typically you would have a range 0 to 4% across institutions. Now, I realize there is the dark realm, and I call it the enemy beyond the walls, which is ad hoc arbitration. In that sense, we don't have available data. But I would venture to say, having sat in a number of those cases, that it doesn't change much. In fact, it could be much worse. Why? Because there's no reporting. Now, institutions are under pressure to report diversity and inclusion, so they need to have some statistics showing that we're doing something. But for ad hoc, no one has that incentive or that motivation. And in all honesty, no one cares, right? So, again, we found that there is no correlation, literally, between African parties, African laws, and sectors in any event. Africans, better prospect for appointment, remain in domestic jurisdiction-specific cases. We've seen that with some of the institutions that exist on the continent. Dual nationals in the diaspora sit more on international cases. And that is the interesting part. When you have an African institution on the continent, for that institution to be credible, trusted, and branded, and appear on a whitelist somewhere for any database, many of which are not very credible, you need to show internationalism. How would you do that? By having non-Africans on your board and appointments. So even within the domestic cases, You don't have the luxury of doing anything if you want to be perceived credibly in that sense. Now, despite the underrepresentation of Africans and low percentage of African appointments, our British institutions are doing better than parties. And I tell you that because I sit in cases, including investment cases recently, where I have taken it as a rule of thumb to include an African name, even in cases that does not include African parties. The immediate response of the other side, why? Now, the response for arbitrators who I sit with, big names, tell you, oh, I have a view that I sit with people that I know. Excuse me? Or, why that person? We don't know that person. Yes, the whole idea, we don't know. I have not sat with that person. I don't have a vested interest, but why don't we try and see if it works, or present it to the parties at least as an option? That takes me to the future dynamics. And I think that if institutions or organizations like AfAA, thinking about African Arbitration Association Conference, you need to do more work in terms of pursuing institutions and asking them questions and developing what I call a diversity inclusion trust mark seal, right? To push institutions to provide more details and Africa-related statistics with sufficient and necessary granularity and distinctions, I must say, between Africans in the diaspora and on the continent. This continent still have people living and practicing on. And as I told you, I am not a victim of that. I am a beneficiary of that system, candidly, right? There's nothing wrong with that. But I would like to see more Africans and more colleagues on board. I think we can also develop what I call an Africa on tour or Africa under the spotlight initiatives. One, I think, great initiative that ICSID had a special issue on review on Africa 2019 by African authors. So when you look on that, it's 2019, it's all African authors, substantive, very good information, is an illustrative example of how you can showcase. You can meet people in conferences, you can meet people in events, but this doesn't mean that you're going to get the work. And if you get it once, doesn't mean you're going to get it again. What counts is people who have the ability to do the work. So this brings me to the third one, which is collective action as part of the pledges and promises, so that arbitrators sitting in cases would insist on including qualified African names in lists exchanged between arbitrators, just like we do with gender. And by the way, speaking of gender, 2 weeks ago, I told Sama about this. 2 weeks ago, in an investment case, I'm sitting with a very big name in the world of international arbitration, and I put in a list of 10, 5 males and 5. He said, fine, but why are we including females? Yeah. 2 weeks ago. I told him because I'm going to include females. By the way, I don't take a step back, I don't shy away, and I stand my ground. He said, but I'm not aware of any rule that requires us to include females on the list. I told him I'm also not aware of a rule that requires to include males on the list. What is the point? Now, you throw it to we ended up as a compromise with a list of 6 that included 3 males and 3 females. And we'll see what the parties will say. But it's interesting. Some people still have that mindset. So imagine a battle with females that people don't dare to speak about in public. It's going to even worse when you speak about ethnic minorities in that sense. But remember, the key word is qualified. And I tell you that wholeheartedly, because if you include people who are not qualified on the list, 1, you lose credibility. 2, you're harming the cause of advancing Africans. Because the first thing they will tell you, look, we are appointing an African and this is the outcome. So African practitioners need to work hard, that is true, to build experience and track record. It's unavoidable. At times of global tensions and friction, and the world is the great theater today of that, Africans can be a neutral choice. And as I mentioned, this is happening today. There's a silver lining. There are regions that are in armed conflicts or countries in armed conflicts with each other. Africans could be a natural choice for that. Prioritizing substance over networking and understanding that competition does not eclipse or undermine camaraderie or collaboration. The English bar is an example to learn from. There is a lot of people who are members of the English bar. The English bar is very strong, and the English profession, I have huge admiration and respect. They compete, but you will not find them, 1, bad-mouthing each other. You will not find that anyone telling you, oh, this person is, don't go there. At the end of the day, they work together and they all benefit. And as I mentioned before, Africans have tried it their way. We think that we boost our chances by canceling each other. It hasn't worked. Try something different. So I think the target is to elevate the human resources of Africa to be part of Africa's precious natural resources. Why do we treat natural resources of Africa and give it a higher priority compared to natural resources when the world is racing for these resources? So let's try and work on making this as part of the natural resources for the continent to be considered. I will leave you with one thing. It is incumbent upon us to restore the world's faith in African wisdom and in Africans' integrity and craft. It's not going to be anyone who would do that. It's going to be us. If you've got substance, people will respect you, even if they disagree, and they may disagree with you. But respect will never be taken away. And I think we need to do a lot of work there. And apologies for taking a lot of your time. Thank you very much.